The night was unnervingly still in the vast expanse of Black Hollow National Park. Towering pines, their branches clawing at the crescent moon, stood like silent sentinels against the blackened sky. The only sounds were the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant owl. Park Ranger Ethan Vance tightened his grip on his flashlight, its beam slicing through the oppressive darkness as he trudged along the overgrown trail. Ethan had worked at Black Hollow for nearly a decade, but this stretch of forest always unnerved him. It wasn't just the isolation or the eerie quiet. It was the stories. Locals whispered of hikers disappearing, campers vanishing without a trace, and strange lights seen flickering deep in the woods. Ethan had always dismissed them as campfire tales, but tonight something felt different. Earlier that evening, a frantic call had come through from the ranger station. A young couple had reported hearing blood-curdling screams near Devil's Crag, a jagged cliff on the far edge of the park. They had tried to investigate, but were overcome by an overwhelming sense of dread. Their descriptions were vague, but their terror was unmistakable. Ethan had volunteered to check it out, more out of obligation than belief. The further he ventured into the woods, the heavier the air seemed to grow. His radio crackled intermittently, bursts of static breaking the silence. Ethan paused, adjusting the dial, but the interference persisted. "Base, this is Ranger Vance," he said, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. "Do you copy?" The radio hissed, then went silent. Ethan cursed under his breath. The deeper parts of the park were notorious for poor reception, but the timing felt ominous. He continued on, his boots crunching against the frost-laden ground. The temperature seemed to plummet the closer he got to Devil's Crag, and an unnatural chill settled over him. He pulled his jacket tighter and pressed on. As he approached the crag, the forest seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their gnarled roots twisting across the path like skeletal hands. The air carried a faint metallic tang, sharp and acrid, like blood. Ethan's flashlight flickered, its beam dimming and sputtering before plunging him into darkness. He tapped it against his palm, muttering a string of curses. The light returned, weak but functional, and in its feeble glow, Ethan noticed something odd. The ground was littered with animal bones, small, fragile remnants scattered haphazardly. His breath quickened as he stepped over them, the sense of unease mounting with every step. Then he heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees, so deep it seemed to vibrate in his chest. Ethan froze, his heart pounding like a war drum. He swept his flashlight in the direction of the sound, but it revealed nothing, only shadows shifting between the trees. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of leaves. "Who's there?" Ethan called, his voice firmer than he felt. No response. The flashlight's beam caught something, a pair of eyes, reflecting the light like burning embers. They hovered just beyond the edge of the trail, but too high to belong to any animal Ethan knew. They blinked once, twice, then vanished. The growl deepened into a snarl, and the shadows seemed to close in around him. Ethan backed away, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol at his hip. He had encountered bears, wolves, even mountain lions during his time as a ranger, but this felt different. This was no ordinary predator. Suddenly, a piercing scream tore through the night, thus light, so raw and primal it sent a chill racing down his spine. It was a sound of pure, unfiltered terror, and it came from just ahead. Ethan broke into a run, the flashlight's beam bouncing erratically as he navigated the uneven terrain. The scream came again, louder, more desperate, and then abruptly cut off. He reached the edge of Devil's Crag, the ground dropping away into a yawning abyss. His flashlight illuminated the area, revealing nothing but jagged rocks and the inky black void below. His breath came in ragged gasps as he scanned the cliffside, searching for any sign of the source. That's when he saw the blood. A dark smear stretched across the rocks, glistening in the pale light. Ethan followed the trail, his pulse hammering in his ears. The blood led to the base of a twisted tree, its roots clawing at the earth like skeletal fingers. Something hung from the branches, a bundle of tattered fabric swaying gently in the wind. Ethan approached cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his hand. As he drew closer, the bundle came into focus. It was a shirt, shredded and stained with blood. Beneath it, the ground was disturbed, as though something or someone had been dragged into the forest. The growl came again, impossibly close, and Ethan spun around, drawing his pistol. The flashlight's beam swept through the trees, but the shadows seemed to mock him, shifting and writhing just beyond reach. His radio crackled to life, a burst of static followed by a distorted voice. "Ranger, Vance." The voice was barely a whisper, distorted and broken, but unmistakable. It was his own voice. Ethan's blood ran cold. He stared at the radio, his mind racing. Before he could react, the ground beneath him seemed to shift, the earth trembling as a deafening roar split the air. He stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the ground. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and grotesque. Its skin was pale and taut, stretched over a gaunt frame. Eyes like burning coals bored into Ethan, filled with a malevolent intelligence. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it let out a guttural snarl that shook Ethan to his core. He raised his pistol and fired, the gunshots echoing through the forest. The creature didn't flinch. It moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Ethan barely had time to react before it was upon him, its clawed hand striking his chest with bone-crushing force. The impact sent him sprawling, his vision swimming as pain lanced through his body. The creature loomed over him, its breath hot and rancid. Desperation fueled his movements as he reached for his flashlight, aiming its beam directly into the creature's eyes. It recoiled with a shriek, its form dissolving into the shadows. Ethan didn't wait to see if it would return. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline propelling him forward as he fled the crag. The forest seemed alive with movement, shadows darting between the trees, whispers echoing in the darkness. He ran blindly, his breath ragged until the faint glow of the ranger station came into view. He burst through the door, slamming it shut behind him. His colleagues stared, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. Ethan tried to explain, but the words caught in his throat. His hands trembled as he pointed to the radio. It crackled to life again, and this time the voice was clear. "Ranger Vance," it said, low and guttural. "You should have stayed away." The radio fell silent, and the room descended into an uneasy stillness. Ethan looked out the window, his reflection staring back at him. But in the glass, just beyond the tree line, a pair of burning eyes watched. The moon hung high over the sprawling expanse of Red Pines Reserve, its pale glow casting ghostly shadows across the landscape. Park Ranger Laura Green sat in her Jeep at the edge of the forest, tapping a pen against her notepad. It was her second year on the job, and while the isolation had been an adjustment, she had grown to love the serenity of the wilderness. Tonight, however, felt different. The air was heavy, charged with an unexplainable tension, and the woods seemed eerily quiet. Her radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Base to Ranger Green. Come in," the dispatcher's voice called, slightly distorted. "This is Green. Go ahead," she replied, leaning forward to grab the handheld. "We've got a report from the Holloway Trail. Campers heard strange noises. Screams. Maybe? You're closest. Can you check it out?" Laura sighed, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. "Midnight. Of course." She clicked the radio. "Copy that. I'm on my way." Holloway Trail was notorious among the Rangers. Known for its rugged terrain and dense forest canopy, it was a hotspot for unexplained phenomena. Whispers on the wind, footsteps that didn't belong to any living creature, and most disturbingly, the missing time incidents. Hikers would swear they'd only been gone an hour, only to emerge after days dehydrated and disoriented. Most people chalked it up to getting lost, but Laura wasn't so sure. As she navigated the twisting dirt roads toward the trailhead, the unease in her stomach grew. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the towering trees. Their branches intertwined above, forming a canopy so thick it swallowed most of the moonlight. When she arrived, the parking lot was empty, save for an old, rusted sedan. The camper's car, she assumed. Laura grabbed her flashlight and stepped out, her boots crunching against the gravel. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves. She flicked on the flashlight and started down the trail, the beam casting long, dancing shadows on the ground. About a mile in, she found the campsite. A tent stood at the edge of a clearing, but something was off. The fabric was torn, flapping lightly in the breeze, and the fire pit was cold, as if abandoned hours ago. Laura called out, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "Hello? Park Ranger? Is anyone here?" No response. She circled the tent, finding signs of a struggle, claw marks on the trees, deep gouges in the soil. Her flashlight caught something on the ground, a shoe, small and worn, lying on its side. Beside it was a trail of disturbed leaves leading deeper into the forest. Her instincts screamed at her to call for backup, but a faint noise stopped her in her tracks. It was a cry, soft and pitiful, like a child lost in the woods. "Hello?" she called again, louder this time, her grip on the flashlight tightening. The cry came again, a little closer. Against her better judgment, she followed the sound, veering off the marked trail and into the underbrush. The deeper she went, the stranger the forest became. The trees grew gnarled and twisted, their bark blackened as if scorched. The air grew colder, and a faint metallic smell filled her nostrils. Her flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker with each step. Then she saw it. A figure, small and hunched, sitting at the base of a tree. It was the source of the crying. "Hey, are you okay?" Laura asked, her voice soft but firm as she approached. The figure didn't respond. She stepped closer, the flashlight illuminating a pale, childlike face streaked with tears. But something was wrong. The face was too pale, features too perfect, like a porcelain doll come to life. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, shimmering like glass. A cold dread washed over Laura as she realized the crying had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. "Are you lost?" she whispered, though every fiber of her being screamed at her to run. The child turned its head slowly, unnaturally, its neck creaking like an old door hinge. When it spoke, its voice was not that of a child, but a deep, guttural growl. "You shouldn't be here." Laura stumbled back, her flashlight flickering wildly. The child, or whatever it was, stood, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it stepped into the light, its form began to change. The delicate features twisted and stretched, the skin darkening and splitting until a grotesque, towering figure stood before her. Its limbs were impossibly long, its hands ending in sharp, claw-like fingers. Its face was a hollow void, a swirling darkness that seemed to pull at her very soul. She turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, her heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing in around her, their branches clawing at her clothes and hair. She tripped, falling hard onto the ground. Her flashlight skittered away, plunging her into darkness. The growl came again, impossibly close, and she scrambled to her feet, grabbing the flashlight with trembling hands. When she turned it on, the beam landed on a pair of eyes, glowing, hateful, and fixed on her. The creature lunged, its claws slashing through the air, and Laura ducked just in time. She bolted down the trail, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps pursuing her. The parking lot was close. She could see the faint glow of her Jeep's headlights through the trees. Just as she reached the edge of the forest, a cold, clammy hand grabbed her arm, pulling her back with inhuman strength. She screamed, twisting free, and turned to see the creature looming over her, its hollow face inches from hers. A distorted voice echoed from the void. "You'll never leave." In a final act of desperation, Laura swung her flashlight, the metal casing striking the creature's head. It recoiled with a shriek, and she took the chance to sprint to her Jeep. She dove inside, slamming the door and locking it. The engine roared to life, and she sped away, the creature's silhouette shrinking in the rearview mirror. Back at the station, Laura tried to report what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. When her colleagues returned to the campsite the next morning, there was no sign of the creature or the campers. The torn tent was gone, the claw marks erased as if the forest had swallowed all evidence of what had transpired. Laura quit her job the next day, but the memory of that night haunted her. In the darkest hours, she would sometimes hear faint whispers, like the forest calling her back. And in her dreams, she saw those hollow eyes always watching, waiting. The fog rolled thick over the sprawling expanse of Whispering Pines National Park, cloaking the trees in a suffocating shroud. Ranger Tom Bishop squinted through the haze as he guided his Jeep down the narrow dirt road toward Dead Man's Loop, a trail he avoided unless duty called. Tonight, it had. A hiker had been reported missing earlier in the day, and Tom had drawn the short straw to investigate. Dead Man's Loop was infamous among the locals. Stories of strange sightings, disembodied voices, and hikers vanishing without a trace were whispered at every campfire. Tom had always dismissed the tales, chalking them up to urban legends or the wilderness playing tricks on the mind. But as the headlights pierced the eerie mist, an unshakable unease began to take hold. He arrived at the trailhead and parked. The night was unnervingly silent. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Grabbing his flashlight and radio, Tom stepped into the oppressive darkness. The beam of light cut through the fog, revealing gnarled roots snaking across the ground and branches hanging low like skeletal arms. About half a mile in, he found the hiker's abandoned backpack. It was propped against a tree, its contents scattered as if rifled through in a hurry. "Base, this is Bishop," he said into the radio, his voice echoing hollowly in the mist. "I found the backpack. No sign of the hiker yet." Static answered him. Tom frowned and tried again. "Base, do you copy?" A faint reply came, but it wasn't from the radio. It was a voice, a woman's, soft and distant, carried on the cold breeze. "Help me." He froze, straining to pinpoint the direction of the sound. "Hello," he called out, shining his flashlight into the surrounding trees. The voice came again, closer this time, but no less ethereal. "Please, help me." Tom's pulse quickened. He stepped off the trail, pushing through the dense undergrowth toward the sound. The fog thickened as he moved deeper into the woods, muffling every sound except for the pounding of his heart. The voice led him onward, always just out of reach. Finally, he stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood a figure, a woman dressed in a tattered hiking jacket, her back to him. Her long, dark hair hung in damp strands, and her head was tilted at an unnatural angle. "Ma'am?" Tom said cautiously, stepping closer. "Are you hurt?" She didn't respond. Instead, she began to hum, a low, haunting melody that sent chills crawling up his spine. Tom edged closer, his flashlight trembling in his grip. "Ma'am, I'm a park ranger. I'm here to help." The humming stopped abruptly. The woman's head snapped around, far more than humanly possible, until her empty, black eyes locked onto his. Her face was gaunt and pale, her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "You shouldn't have come," she hissed, her voice layered with something inhuman. Tom stumbled backward, his flashlight beam shaking wildly as the woman began to advance. Her movements were jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. He fumbled for his radio, his voice breaking. "Base, this is Bishop. I need backup, now." Static crackled, then a distorted voice answered. "You shouldn't have come." The radio fell silent, and so did the forest. The woman was gone. Tom spun in a circle, his breath ragged, but the clearing was empty. The fog pressed in around him, swallowing the trees, the trail, everything. He turned to head back, but realized with a sinking feeling that he had no idea which direction he'd come from. Then he heard the whispers. They came from all around, soft and insidious, like the forest itself was speaking. "Turn back. You'll never leave. It's too late." The air grew colder, biting through his jacket, and the flashlight flickered, its beam growing weaker. Shadows began to move at the edge of his vision, tall, thin figures that seemed to glide between the trees. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. Tom ran. He didn't care where, as long as it was away from whatever was closing in. The fog seemed to thicken, wrapping around him like a living thing. His flashlight gave one final sputter before plunging him into darkness. He tripped over something, a root maybe, and fell hard onto the ground. As he pushed himself up, his hand landed on something soft. He shone the dim beam of his phone's flashlight onto the object and felt his stomach drop. It was a body. The hiker's lifeless eyes stared back at him, frozen in a mask of terror. Deep gouges raked across her chest, and her twisted limbs told a story of unspeakable violence. Tom staggered to his feet, bile rising in his throat. He turned to flee, but froze when he saw them. Figures surrounded the clearing, tall, shadowy forms with glowing eyes, their outlines shifting like smoke. They stood motionless, watching him. The whispers turned into laughter, low, guttural, and cruel. One of the figures stepped forward, its shape solidifying into the woman he had seen earlier. She grinned, her black eyes glinting. "You're ours now," she whispered. Tom screamed and ran, tearing through the underbrush. The trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at his clothes and face. The laughter followed him, growing louder, more frenzied. He didn't stop until he saw the faint glow of the trailhead through the fog. He burst into the parking lot, collapsing against his Jeep. His hands fumbled with the keys as he glanced back toward the forest. The fog lingered at the tree line, unnaturally thick, and he could swear he saw glowing eyes watching him from the shadows. The engine roared to life, and Tom sped away, not daring to look back. When he returned the next day with reinforcements, the forest was calm. The fog had lifted, and there was no sign of the hiker or the clearing he had stumbled into. Even the backpack was gone. His colleagues chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe hallucinations brought on by stress. But Tom knew better. At night, when he lay awake, he could still hear the whispers, and sometimes when he passed by the edge of the forest, he would see her standing there, waiting. The storm rolled in quickly over Blackthorn National Forest, a violent wall of thunder and rain that transformed the already remote wilderness into an unforgiving nightmare. Park Ranger Emily Hart cursed her luck as she pulled on her rain jacket and grabbed the radio. A frantic call from a campsite near Lake Forsaken had come in moments ago, something about strange noises and lights in the woods. The couple had sounded panicked before the line abruptly cut off. The lake wasn't a place Emily liked visiting, especially at night. Stories swirled about the area, accounts of hikers seeing figures reflected in the water that weren't there when they turned around, of lights that danced just out of reach, and an inexplicable, suffocating sense of dread. But her job wasn't to believe in ghost stories, it was to keep people safe. The dirt road leading to the lake was washed out, forcing her to hike the last mile in the torrential downpour. Her flashlight's beam struggled against the rain, illuminating only a few feet ahead of her. The forest seemed alive, the wind howling through the trees, bending their skeletal forms as though they were reaching for her. When she finally reached the campsite, her unease deepened. The tent was there, but it was shredded, hanging in tatters from the poles. Clothes and supplies were scattered everywhere, soaked through and covered in mud. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely audible over the storm. "This is Ranger Hart. Is anyone here?" No answer. She circled the campsite, the beam of her flashlight sweeping across the ground. There were deep gouges in the earth, claw marks that led away from the site and into the woods. Emily felt the hairs on her neck rise. They didn't look like anything a bear or mountain lion would leave behind. A low hum caught her attention, a strange, rhythmic sound, almost like chanting, carried on the wind. It came from the direction of the lake. Against her better judgment, Emily followed, her boots squelching in the muddy ground. The hum grew louder as she approached the water, becoming almost hypnotic. The rain began to lessen, as though the storm itself hesitated near the lake's edge. When she emerged from the trees, the sight before her made her stomach churn. The lake was unnaturally still, its surface like polished glass despite the storm. In the center, a faint, otherworldly glow pulsed beneath the water, illuminating the skeletal remains of a long submerged dock. At the edge of the lake stood the couple, backs to her, motionless and dripping wet. "Hey!" Emily shouted, breaking into a run. "Are you okay? What happened?" They didn't respond. As she approached, she saw their heads tilt back slightly as though listening to something she couldn't hear. Then, without warning, they stepped forward, straight into the water. "Wait!" Emily yelled, lunging to grab them, but her hand passed through empty air. They were gone, vanished beneath the surface without a ripple. She stumbled back, heart pounding as the humming grew deafening. The glow in the lake intensified, swirling like a living thing. She felt an unnatural pull, as though something beneath the surface was beckoning her. Her legs felt heavy, her movements sluggish, as if the air around her had turned to molasses. "Help us!" The voice was faint, hollow, and came from the direction of the water. It wasn't the couple's voice. It was layered, many voices overlapping, pleading and desperate. Shapes began to appear beneath the surface, pale and indistinct, writhing just out of focus. Emily's breath hitched as she realized they were faces. Dozens of them. The glow shifted, casting long, spindly shadows across the shoreline as the faces pressed against the water's surface, mouths moving in silent screams. Then the chanting stopped. Silence. Emily took a step back, her boots slipping on the muddy ground. The water's surface rippled violently, and a towering shape began to rise from the lake. It was impossible to fully comprehend. Dark and shapeless, yet undeniably alive, with dozens of glowing eyes scattered across its form. It stood unnaturally still for a moment, then extended something like an arm toward her. Emily turned and ran, every instinct in her body screaming at her to get away. The forest seemed to warp as she fled, the trees twisting and leaning as though trying to trap her. Behind her, the sound of heavy, sloshing footsteps grew louder, and the chanting returned, now inside her head, growing more insistent. "You can't run. You belong to us." She stumbled into the campsite, nearly collapsing as her legs threatened to give out. The shredded tent flapped in the wind, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she thought she saw one of the glowing eyes peering out from within. Emily didn't stop. She barreled through the woods, barely able to see through the rain, until she finally reached her truck. She dove inside, locking the doors and fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and she sped down the dirt road, her tires skidding dangerously on the muddy terrain. In the rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of something massive moving through the trees. Its glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like searchlights. But as she reached the main road, the presence seemed to vanish, the oppressive weight in the air lifting. Back at the ranger station, Emily filed a report. Search parties were dispatched, but there was no sign of the couple or the shredded campsite. The official conclusion was that the storm had caused them to get lost, swept into the lake by rising waters. But Emily knew better. She still hears the chanting sometimes, faint and distant in the quiet hours of the night. And when she closes her eyes, she sees those glowing eyes staring back at her, waiting for the day she'll return to Lake Forsaken. The first snow of the season blanketed the towering peaks of the Redwood Divide National Park, transforming the rugged terrain into a landscape of pristine white. Ranger Daniel Kessler, a seasoned veteran of the park's harsh winters, had grown accustomed to solitude during these months. Visitors dwindled, leaving the forest silent except for the occasional howl of wolves or the groan of ancient trees under the weight of snow. But tonight felt wrong. Daniel sat in the ranger station, sipping coffee while monitoring the radio. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but another sound pricked his ears, a faint knock. His brow furrowed. He wasn't expecting anyone. Setting his mug down, he grabbed his flashlight and headed to the door. When he opened, the icy wind bit at his face, and snow swirled in the air. No one was there. He scanned the area, the beam of his flashlight illuminating nothing but snow-covered ground. Then he saw them, footprints. Small, barefoot prints leading away from the station and into the forest. "Hello?" he called, his voice swallowed by the wind. No answer. Logic told him someone must be in trouble. Nobody would survive long out there without proper gear. Grabbing his jacket and radio, Daniel followed the prints, his boots crunching in the snow. The trail led deeper into the woods, winding between the towering pines. The farther he went, the more the air seemed to grow heavier, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. The footprints remained consistent, small, deliberate steps, perfectly spaced, despite the uneven terrain. After about 20 minutes, Daniel came upon a clearing. In the center stood an old wooden cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. The structure wasn't on any park maps, and he'd never seen it during his patrols. The footprints led straight to the door. He hesitated. Something about the cabin felt off. The windows were dark, and the air around it was unnaturally still, as though the storm refused to touch it. "Is anyone in there?" Daniel called out, his voice echoing through the clearing. Silence. Cautiously, he approached and knocked on the door. It creaked open at his touch, revealing an interior cloaked in shadows. The air was thick and stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that made his stomach turn. "Hello?" He tried again, stepping inside. His flashlight swept across the room, revealing old furniture coated in dust and cobwebs. A rusted wood stove sat cold in the corner, and the walls were lined with shelving jars filled with unidentifiable substances. At the center of the room was a table. On it lay a single object, a small child's shoe, crusted with dried blood. Daniel's pulse quickened. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. His flashlight flickered, plunging the room into intermittent darkness. Then he heard it, a faint giggle, high-pitched and chilling, coming from behind him. "Who's there?" he demanded, spinning around. The beam of his flashlight landed on a figure crouched in the corner. It was a child, no older than 6, with pale skin and dark, sunken eyes. She wore a tattered dress and no shoes, her bare feet pressed against the cold wooden floor. "Are you lost?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The girl didn't answer. She tilted her head, her black eyes glinting in the light. Then, with inhuman speed, she darted across the room, disappearing into the shadows. Daniel's heart pounded as he swung the flashlight wildly, but the beam revealed nothing. The giggle came again, this time from the opposite corner. "Stay where you are," he shouted, backing toward the door. The temperature in the room plummeted, his breath now visible in the faint light. The walls seemed to groan, and the jars on the shelves began to rattle. The giggle grew louder, joined by whispers, dozens of voices speaking in a language he didn't understand. Suddenly, the girl reappeared, standing in the middle of the room. Her head was tilted back unnaturally far, her mouth stretched into a wide, jagged grin. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed, her voice layered with something ancient and malevolent. Before Daniel could react, the girl lunged at him, her small hands gripping his wrist with impossible strength. Her touch was ice cold, burning through his jacket like frostbite. He swung the flashlight, the heavy metal connecting with her head. She let out an ear-piercing shriek and dissolved into a swirl of shadows that rushed past him and through the walls. The whispers stopped. The room fell silent. Daniel didn't wait to see what would happen next. He threw open the door and ran, the cold biting at his face as he sprinted back through the forest. The footprints he'd followed earlier were gone, erased as though they'd never existed. When he finally reached the ranger station, he locked the door behind him and collapsed against it, his chest heaving. His flashlight flickered out completely, leaving him in darkness. The storm raged outside, but inside, the station felt unnervingly still. Daniel's eyes adjusted to the dim light from the crackling fire, and that's when he saw it. On the floor, right in the center of the room, was the same bloodied child's shoe he'd seen on the table in the cabin. A faint giggle echoed through the station, sending a shiver down his spine. The wind whistled through the narrow canyons of Ravenswood National Preserve, carrying with it the eerie echoes of ancient trees creaking under the weight of time. Ranger Alex Moore had patrolled these woods for years, but the isolation of the winter season always set him on edge. Tonight he was tasked with investigating reports of strange lights near the old Black Hollow Trail, a path long abandoned and officially closed to visitors after a series of unexplained disappearances. Alex parked his truck at the trailhead, the headlights cutting through the dense fog that blanketed the forest. The lights had been spotted just after sundown, flickering like fireflies, but larger, brighter, and unsettlingly erratic. Adjusting his flashlight, Alex started down the trail, his boots crunching on frost-covered leaves. The Black Hollow Trail had a reputation among the rangers, one that most dismissed but none completely ignored. It was said to be cursed, the site of rituals performed by a mysterious cult decades ago. Hikers spoke of unnatural cold spots, disembodied whispers, and shadows that moved independently of any living creature. Alex had always chalked up the stories to overactive imaginations, until tonight. As he moved deeper into the woods, the fog thickened, muting the sounds of the forest. Even the wind seemed to die, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Then he saw it, a flicker of light in the distance, pale and ghostly, hovering between the trees. "Hello?" Alex called, his voice swallowed by the mist. The light didn't respond. It bobbed and weaved as if beckoning him to follow. He hesitated but pressed on, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. The light stayed just out of reach, leading him deeper into the forest. Soon he realized the trail was gone, replaced by a tangled maze of roots and brambles. The light grew brighter, its movements more frantic, until it suddenly disappeared. Alex stopped, shining his flashlight around. The beam illuminated a clearing, its center dominated by a large, gnarled oak tree. The tree's bark was scarred with strange symbols, and beneath it lay a circle of stones blackened by fire. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the temperature seemed to plummet. He took a cautious step forward when a low, guttural growl rumbled from the darkness. Swinging his flashlight, Alex caught a glimpse of something crouched just beyond the clearing, a figure hunched and misshapen, its eyes reflecting the light like an animal's. It moved with unnatural jerks, its limbs too long, its posture grotesque. "Who's there?" Alex demanded, his voice steady despite the fear tightening his chest. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to crawl toward him, its movements impossibly fast. Alex stumbled back, his flashlight shaking as the figure entered the light. It was humanoid, but its face was wrong, its features distorted as though melted, with a gaping mouth that stretched far too wide. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, the creature's guttural growls and heavy footsteps close behind. His radio crackled to life, but the voice that came through wasn't from the station. "Turn back," it whispered, distorted and otherworldly. "You don't belong here." Alex ignored it, focusing on the faint glow of his truck's headlights in the distance. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then suddenly stopped. He dared to glance back. The creature was gone, but the light had returned, hovering in the path behind him. This time, it wasn't alone. Dozens of them appeared, forming a ring around him, their glow pulsating like a heartbeat. A voice echoed through the forest, deep and resonant, coming from everywhere and nowhere. You were warned. The ground beneath him trembled, and Alex fell to his knees as the lights closed in. The air grew thick, choking him, and the whispers returned, low, chanting in a language he couldn't understand. He clutched his chest, gasping for breath, as the world around him seemed to dissolve into darkness. When Alex awoke, he was lying on the ground near his truck. The fog had lifted, the forest eerily calm. His radio crackled with the familiar voice of the dispatcher, asking for his status. He sat up, his body aching, his mind racing. The lights, the creature, the voices. It all felt like a nightmare, but the claw marks on his jacket told him otherwise. As he climbed into the truck and drove back to the station, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, he thought he saw the lights hovering in the distance, watching him. He didn't look back again. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging Briarwood National Park into shadow. Ranger Caroline Hughes was midway through her shift, patrolling the farthest reaches of the park near an area locals called the Silent Gorge. Few ventured there, even during peak tourist season. It wasn't marked on any official maps, and most of the staff avoided it, citing inexplicable feelings of dread. Caroline had heard the stories, the whispers of figures moving in the fog, of voices calling your name when no one was there. But she didn't believe in folklore. That night, she was about to. The call had come in an hour earlier. A hiker reported hearing screams from the direction of the gorge. Caroline didn't hesitate. Someone might be injured or lost, and the sun was already setting. She grabbed her flashlight and radio and drove as far as the rough trails would allow. The rest of the journey would be on foot. The forest grew darker as she approached the gorge, the towering pines blotting out the faint moonlight. Caroline's flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the narrow trail. The air was colder here, unnaturally so, and the usual sounds of the forest, chirping insects, rustling leaves, were absent. It was as if the wilderness were holding its breath. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing into the void. "This is Ranger Hughes. Is anyone out here?" No response. She pressed on, the silence pressing down on her like a physical weight. Then, faintly, she heard it. A soft, distant cry. It was high-pitched, almost childlike, and it sent a chill down her spine. "Hello," she called again, quickening her pace. "I'm here to help. Keep calling so I can find you." The cry came again, louder this time, leading her off the trail and into the dense underbrush. The ground grew uneven, and the trees seemed to close in around her. Her flashlight flickered, casting strange, jittery shadows. She paused, tapping the device, but it remained unstable. The crying stopped. Caroline stood still, straining to hear anything over the pounding of her heart. Then, from behind her came a soft whisper. "Caroline." She whipped around, the flashlight beam darting between the trees. No one was there. She swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight tighter. It wasn't possible. She hadn't told anyone her first name over the radio. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Come out where I can see you." Silence. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement, a pale figure slipping between the trees. She swung the flashlight toward it, but found only empty forest. The air grew colder still, her breath now visible in the dim light. "Caroline." The voice came again, closer this time, low and guttural. She turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, ignoring the branches that clawed at her jacket. Her flashlight flickered again, and for a terrifying moment it went out completely. She was plunged into darkness, the shadows around her feeling impossibly alive. When the light flickered back on, she froze. Ahead of her, blocking the path, stood a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its eyes glowed faintly in the beam of her flashlight, empty and unblinking. Caroline took a step back, her hand fumbling for the radio at her belt. "This is Ranger Hughes," she said, her voice cracking. "I need assistance near Silent Gorge." "There's someone here." The static-filled reply came almost immediately. "Ranger Hughes, you're out of range. Please repeat your last." The radio cut off with a burst of static that morphed into a garbled, inhuman voice. "Stay." The figure moved toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Caroline didn't wait to see what it would do next. She turned and bolted, her flashlight bouncing wildly. Behind her, she heard the sound of branches snapping and something heavy dragging across the ground. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the path back to her truck nowhere in sight. Her breathing was ragged, panic overtaking her as the sound of pursuit grew louder. Then, ahead, she saw it, a faint glimmer of light. She sprinted toward it, hope surging through her chest. She burst into another clearing, but her relief was short-lived. The light wasn't from her truck or the ranger station. It was a circle of faintly glowing orbs, hovering in the air like will-o'-the-wisps. They pulsed softly, casting an eerie light over the clearing. Caroline stopped, unable to take her eyes off the orbs. They seemed to hum, a low vibration that resonated in her chest. Then the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and chaotic. She covered her ears, but the voices were inside her head. "You shouldn't have come here," they said, the words overlapping in a dissonant chorus. "You were warned." She turned to run, but the tall figure was there, blocking her path. It towered over her, its glowing eyes fixed on hers. Slowly, it raised one impossibly long arm, pointing toward the circle of orbs. "No," Caroline shouted, backing away. "Stay away from me." The figure didn't move. The orbs pulsed brighter, the hum growing louder until it was deafening. The air grew thick, and Caroline felt herself being pulled toward the center of the clearing, her legs moving against her will. As she neared the orbs, the forest around her seemed to dissolve, replaced by a void of endless darkness. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the figure, its face twisting into a grotesque smile. Caroline woke hours later, lying on the ground near the trailhead. Her truck was in sight, its headlights cutting through the fog. She sat up, her head pounding, her body aching as though she'd been dragged through the forest. The radio crackled to life. "Ranger Hughes, come in. We lost contact with you hours ago. Are you all right?" She hesitated, staring at the woods behind her. The forest was silent again, the oppressive weight gone, but the memory of what had happened lingered like a shadow. "I'm here," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm coming back." As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, she thought she saw glowing orbs hovering between the trees, watching her leave. She didn't look back again. The winter wind cut sharply through Blackstone National Forest, a place of ancient, towering trees and stories whispered around campfires. Ranger Ethan Cole had heard them all. Tales of strange figures moving through the woods, of campers vanishing without a trace, and of an entity the locals called the Watcher. Ethan dismissed it as folklore. After all, he'd spent 6 years patrolling these woods and had never seen anything more dangerous than a bear. But tonight, as he sat in the ranger station sipping coffee, something about the silence outside felt different, unsettling. The usual nighttime sounds, howling wolves, rustling leaves, were absent. Even the wind seemed muted. Ethan's radio crackled to life, shattering the stillness. "Station 3, this is Station 2. Do you copy?" Ethan grabbed the receiver. "Station 3 here. What's going on?" "We just got a report of strange lights near Deep Hollow. A couple of hikers said they saw something moving out there." "Can you check it out?" Deep Hollow. Ethan suppressed a groan. The area was notorious for strange stories, and even some of the rangers refused to patrol there. "Copy that," he said, grabbing his flashlight and gear. The drive to Deep Hollow took 20 minutes, the narrow dirt road winding through dense forest. By the time Ethan arrived at the trailhead, the moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. He stepped out of the truck, the crunch of his boots on the frost-covered ground unnervingly loud in the silence. The trail leading into Deep Hollow was overgrown, the trees forming a canopy so thick that even moonlight struggled to penetrate. Ethan's flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he followed the path, the air growing colder with every step. "Hello?" he called out. "Park ranger. Is anyone out here?" No response. About a mile in, he noticed something odd. The trees around him were scarred, deep gouges running vertically down their trunks as if clawed by something massive. He knelt to inspect the marks, frowning. No animal he knew of could make those. As he stood, a faint glow appeared in the distance, a soft, pulsating light. It hovered just above the ground, shifting between pale blue and white. Ethan's pulse quickened. "Hello?" he called again, stepping cautiously toward the light. The glow remained still for a moment before darting deeper into the forest. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, as if it wanted him to follow. Against his better judgment, Ethan complied. The light led him off the trail and into an area of the forest he didn't recognize. The trees here were twisted, their branches gnarled and reaching like skeletal fingers. The air felt heavy and a faint hum vibrated in his ears. Finally, the light stopped, hovering in front of a large, moss-covered boulder. Ethan approached, shining his flashlight over the area. At the base of the boulder was an opening, a narrow, jagged entrance leading underground. He hesitated. Every instinct told him to turn back, but curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, urged him forward. The entrance was just wide enough for him to squeeze through, the tunnel sloping downward into darkness. The air inside was damp and cold, and the hum grew louder, reverberating in his chest. The tunnel opened into a cavern. Ethan froze. In the center of the cavern was a massive stone altar, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under his gaze. Surrounding it were bones, human and animal, piled haphazardly. The glow from before was here, but now it was spread across the cavern walls, pulsating like a heartbeat. And then he saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms barely human. They were tall and impossibly thin, their limbs elongated and twisted. Their faces were featureless, save for hollow sockets where eyes should have been. They moved silently, circling the altar, their heads tilting unnaturally as they turned toward Ethan. He stumbled back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the cavern. The figures didn't stop. They moved closer, their motions jerky and unnatural. The hum grew louder, accompanied by whispers. Dozens of voices overlapping in a language he couldn't understand. Ethan backed toward the tunnel, but before he could turn, one of the figures raised a hand. The cavern plunged into complete darkness, the glow extinguished. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for his flashlight. When it flickered back on, he gasped. The figures were gone, but he was no longer in the cavern. He was standing in the middle of the forest, near the trailhead where he'd started. His truck was in sight, its headlights still on, casting long shadows over the trees. Ethan's heart raced as he stumbled toward the vehicle. Climbing inside, he locked the doors and sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady his breathing. His radio crackled to life again. "Station 3, this is Station 2. Do you copy?" He grabbed the receiver with shaking hands. "This is Station 3. I'm here. What's going on?" There was a pause. "We've been trying to reach you for hours. Are you all right?" "Hours?" he repeated, glancing at the dashboard clock. It was nearly dawn. Somehow an entire night had passed. "I'm coming back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As he drove back to the station, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The forest seemed alive, the shadows deeper, more menacing. When he finally arrived, he parked and glanced in the rearview mirror. Behind him, at the edge of the tree line, stood one of the figures. Its hollow sockets seemed to stare directly into his soul. Ethan turned away, his hands trembling as he grabbed his gear and bolted inside the station. He didn't look back, but he could feel it. Watching, waiting. The locals were right. The Watcher was real. And now it knew his name.